Please, just let me make one last call. The old man's voice was barely louder than the soft beeping of heart monitors echoing through the emergency department. Yet somehow those 9 words seemed to hang in the air longer than any alarm. Nobody stopped walking. Nurses hurried past with clipboards tucked against their chests. Doctors disappeared behind swinging doors without looking back. Families crowded the waiting area, whispering prayers and checking their phones, each carrying worries too heavy to notice another stranger's pain. Security Officer Daniel Reese adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder and stepped in front of the elderly man before he could take another slow step toward the nurse's station. "Sir, you need to sit down. Hospital policy." The old man nodded politely, though his breathing had become noticeably uneven. His faded brown jacket looked decades old, the sleeves slightly frayed near the cuffs, and the leather shoes on his feet had lost their shine years ago. Nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. If anything, he looked like someone who had spent too many cold nights alone. "I understand," he answered quietly. "I only need 30 seconds. Daniel shook his head with practiced patience. "No personal phones in the treatment area. You'll have to wait." Around them, fluorescent lights reflected across polished tile floors, making everything feel colder than it really was. Outside, late autumn rain tapped steadily against the tall glass entrance, turning the parking lot into a blurry sea of headlights and reflections. Ambulance sirens faded somewhere beyond the storm before disappearing into the distance. The old man slowly lowered his eyes. His fingers trembled ever so slightly as he reached inside his coat, only to discover the pocket where his phone should have been was empty. His shoulders sank almost imperceptibly, not in anger, not in frustration, simply in quiet disappointment. Several feet away, Naomi Brooks stood behind the reception counter finishing paperwork for the overnight shift. 22 years old, with calm brown eyes and neatly braided hair pulled into a low bun, she had already spent 10 exhausting hours, helping frightened families fill out forms, directing patients to exam rooms, and answering questions she often wished had easier answers. She noticed the old man because he wasn't raising his voice. Most desperate people shouted. They demanded. They argued. This man simply waited, as though he believed kindness might still exist if he remained patient long enough. Naomi watched him take one careful breath after another. Something about the way he stood reminded her of her father during his final night in a hospital hallway years earlier, when every minute had mattered and every unanswered request had felt impossibly heavy. She swallowed hard, trying to push the memory away, but it lingered like the rain against the windows. The security officer gently motioned toward a chair. "Please, sir." The old man looked toward the exit instead, then back at the receptionist's desk. His eyes carried no fear, only urgency wrapped inside remarkable dignity. "If I can't make that call," he whispered almost to himself, "a great many people may never know the truth." Daniel sighed quietly, assuming confusion had come with age. "Let's get you seated." Before either man could move, Naomi stepped out from behind the counter. Her shoes clicked softly across the polished floor until she stood only a few feet away. Without saying a word at first, she reached into her sweater pocket, unlocked her own cell phone, and held it out toward the stranger. The entire waiting room seemed to fall strangely still. "You can use mine," she said gently. "Take all the time you need." The old man's fingers closed carefully around the phone as though it were something far more valuable than glass and metal. He nodded once to Naomi, gratitude shining quietly across a face marked by countless years, then stepped a few feet away from the crowded reception desk. He entered a single number from memory with surprising confidence, lifted the phone to his ear, and waited. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Naomi found herself watching without meaning to. Something about him felt unusual, not because of the worn jacket or the gentle voice, but because he carried himself with the calm certainty of someone who had spent an entire lifetime making impossible decisions. Then, just as the call connected, his expression softened. "Execute Phoenix," he said in a steady voice. There was a brief pause before he added, "It is time." He ended the call without another word, lowered the phone, and returned it to Naomi with both hands. "Thank you," he said. "You have given me something no amount of money could have purchased tonight." Naomi smiled politely, assuming he simply meant hope. "I am glad I could help." Before she could ask whether he needed anything else, his knees weakened slightly. Daniel immediately stepped forward to support him, while nearby nurses hurried over with a wheelchair. The old man did not resist. He simply allowed them to guide him toward the treatment area, disappearing behind the automatic doors as quietly as he had appeared. Naomi stood still for a moment, her phone warm in her hand, staring at the call log on the screen. There was only one outgoing number, unfamiliar and without a saved contact. She almost deleted it without thinking, then hesitated for reasons she could not explain. Instead, she locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her pocket before returning to the reception desk. Her coworker, Melissa Grant, leaned closer with a curious smile. "You really should not be lending patients your personal phone." Naomi shrugged gently. "He only needed a few seconds." Melissa lowered her voice. "People make strange claims when they are scared. You have to be careful." Naomi nodded, but her thoughts had already drifted somewhere else. Ever since losing her father years ago, hospitals had become more than buildings filled with medicine and machines. They were places where ordinary moments quietly decided the direction of entire lives. She still remembered sitting in another waiting room as a teenager, watching adults rush past while her father kept asking if he could speak to one more family member before another procedure. The request had seemed so simple, yet every minute had disappeared beneath policies, schedules, and paperwork. That memory had never left her. It became the reason she accepted the overnight position after community college. Instead of searching for something easier, she believed kindness often arrived disguised as small inconveniences. Holding a frightened hand, finding an extra blanket, sitting beside someone who had no visitors, letting an exhausted daughter cry without interruption. Those moments never appeared in medical charts, yet somehow they mattered just as much. The rain outside continued tapping against the windows as midnight slipped into the early hours of morning. The waiting room gradually emptied until only a handful of families remained beneath the soft white lights. Naomi organized insurance forms, answered another phone call, and welcomed 2 new patients through the sliding doors. The old man slowly faded into the endless rhythm of another busy shift. She had no reason to believe she would ever see him again. She certainly could not have imagined that somewhere beyond the hospital walls, inside towering office buildings hundreds of miles away, lights were suddenly turning on floor after floor as executives were being awakened from sleep by a message containing only 2 words that had not been spoken aloud in nearly 20 years. Execute Phoenix. Far above the sleeping streets of Manhattan, the top floor of Whitmore Capitol remained almost completely dark except for the faint glow of emergency lights reflecting across polished marble floors. The headquarters had stood as a symbol of American business for nearly half a century, yet very few employees had ever met the company's founder. Arthur Whitmore had slowly withdrawn from public life over the past decade, allowing a board of executives to handle daily operations while newspapers speculated about his health, his fortune, and whether he still influenced the company at all. Most people believed he lived quietly inside one of his estates surrounded by private staff and luxury. The truth was very different. Arthur had spent the last 6 months traveling alone across the country under ordinary clothes, staying in modest hotels, eating in neighborhood diners, and speaking with people who had no idea who he was. After building a business worth billions of dollars, he had begun asking himself a question that no financial report could answer. If every title disappeared, if every expensive suit were replaced with a worn jacket, if every chauffeur and assistant vanished, would anyone still see the man instead of the money? The answers had not been encouraging. Restaurant hosts overlooked him while welcoming wealthier-looking guests. Salespeople rushed toward customers dressed in designer clothing while leaving him to browse alone. Even people who considered themselves kind often smiled politely before moving on without truly seeing him. Yet Arthur never became bitter. He quietly took mental notes, believing that character revealed itself in ordinary moments rather than grand speeches. His latest stop had been the hospital after a persistent pressure in his chest convinced him to seek medical attention. He had intentionally arrived without security, without notifying the company, and without carrying the satellite phone normally reserved for emergencies. He wanted one evening to belong only to Arthur, not to the billionaire whose schedule determined thousands of jobs. Then everything changed faster than he expected. The discomfort in his chest became more serious, and somewhere during the confusion his phone disappeared. For the first time in decades, He found himself unable to reach the one network designed to activate if he ever believed the company faced immediate danger. Earlier that same afternoon, while reviewing documents delivered anonymously to his hotel room, Arthur had uncovered evidence suggesting that trusted executives inside Whitmore Capital were preparing to quietly transfer valuable company assets through a series of legal but deeply dishonest transactions. The plan would not destroy the corporation overnight. Instead, it would slowly drain its future until employees, retirees, and charitable foundations paid the highest price, while only a handful of powerful insiders benefited. Arthur knew there was only one safeguard remaining. Years earlier, he had secretly created Project Phoenix, an emergency protocol that could freeze critical financial decisions, notify independent trustees, and launch an immediate internal review if activated with a single coded instruction. Only 3 people in the world knew the protocol existed, including Arthur himself. Without that call, the protection would remain dormant. Lying inside an examination room beneath soft white lights, Arthur closed his eyes for a brief moment as physicians continued evaluating his condition. He was not thinking about stock prices or personal wealth. His thoughts returned instead to the young receptionist who had offered her phone without asking for identification, status, or proof that his story was true. In a world that often measured people by appearances, Naomi Brooks had measured him by humanity alone. Arthur smiled almost imperceptibly. He still did not know her last name, her story, or whether their paths would ever cross again. But somewhere deep inside, he realized the experiment that had taken him across America had finally given him the answer he had been searching for. Genuine kindness had not disappeared. It had simply become much harder to find. The remainder of Naomi's overnight shift passed with the familiar rhythm she had come to know so well. Wheelchairs rolled quietly across polished floors. Coffee cooled untouched beside computer monitors. The soft hum of ventilation blended with distant conversations and the steady pulse of medical equipment hidden behind closed doors. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the hospital entrance covered in tiny pools that reflected the pale orange glow of sunrise. Naomi gathered a stack of completed admission forms and carried them toward the administrative office, expecting nothing more unusual than another routine shift ending. She had almost forgotten about the elderly man until Melissa approached with a puzzled expression. "The physician asked about you," she said. "About me?" Naomi looked surprised. "Why?" Melissa shrugged. "Apparently the gentleman you helped kept asking whether the young receptionist was all right. He wanted someone to thank you again." Naomi smiled softly. "I'm glad he is feeling better." She thought that would be the end of it. Instead, as she stepped into the break room to collect her coat, Daniel Reese walked in holding a small clear evidence bag. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch with a cracked leather chain. "The patient asked me to give this to you," Daniel explained. Naomi immediately shook her head. "I cannot accept personal gifts from patients." "I told him that," Daniel replied. He smiled and said it was not payment. He said someone once trusted him when he was young, and this watch reminded him that kindness should always be passed forward. Naomi studied the worn watch through the plastic. The initials A.W. were engraved across the back, nearly faded by time. She still refused to take it. "Please return it to him when he is discharged." Daniel nodded. "I figured you would say that." A few minutes later, Naomi clocked out, stepped through the front entrance, and breathed in the cool morning air. The city was slowly waking. Delivery trucks rumbled down damp streets. Commuters hurried toward subway stations carrying paper cups of coffee. The world looked completely ordinary, yet several states away nothing was ordinary anymore. Inside Whitmore Capital headquarters, conference room lights blazed before sunrise as senior executives rushed through security checkpoints after receiving encrypted emergency notifications. Independent auditors arrived carrying sealed cases. Corporate attorneys canceled flights and redirected meetings. Long-forgotten authorization codes suddenly reopened secure digital vaults that had not been accessed in almost 2 decades. Nobody outside the inner circle understood why every scheduled financial transfer had frozen at exactly 3:17 that morning. Confusion spread from office to office as executives discovered that approvals requiring only minutes now required unanimous review from trustees they had never met. Telephones rang without pause. Computer screens displayed messages marked emergency governance protocol. The simple instruction Arthur had spoken from Naomi's phone had quietly set thousands of carefully prepared safeguards into motion. Back at the hospital, Arthur rested comfortably while physicians reviewed encouraging test results. His condition had stabilized far more quickly than expected. One of the doctors smiled. "You were fortunate you came in when you did." Arthur looked toward the window where the first rays of sunlight warmed the glass. "No," he answered gently. "I was fortunate because one young woman believed that a stranger deserved 30 seconds. At that same moment, Naomi boarded her city bus, unaware that her phone number now existed inside one of the most protected investigative files in corporate America. She leaned her head against the window, watching neighborhoods drift past beneath the morning light, thinking only about going home, making breakfast, and getting a few hours of sleep before her next shift. She never imagined that by sunset, people wearing tailored suits would begin searching an entire city for the receptionist whose simple act of compassion had quietly changed the future of a multi-billion-dollar company. Naomi woke late that afternoon to the gentle vibration of her phone resting on the nightstand beside her bed. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, painting warm stripes across the small apartment she had rented since graduating from community college. She stretched, expecting a reminder about her evening shift, but instead found 3 missed calls from the hospital and 1 voicemail from Human Resources asking her to report 30 minutes before her scheduled start time. A faint feeling of concern settled in her chest. During the bus ride back downtown, she replayed the previous night in her mind, searching for anything she might have done incorrectly. She had completed every form, greeted every patient, and followed every procedure she knew. The only unusual moment had been lending her phone to the elderly stranger. Even then, she had acted with nothing but compassion. By the time she entered the employee entrance, the familiar comfort of the hospital seemed strangely different. Conversations became quieter as she walked through the hallway. A few coworkers offered polite smiles, while others glanced toward her before quickly returning to their work. Melissa met her near the reception desk, her expression carrying more sympathy than curiosity this time. "Administration wants to see you upstairs," she whispered. "They have been asking about your phone." Naomi frowned. "My phone?" Melissa nodded. "Someone from corporate security called earlier. They said they needed information about a patient who made a call from it." The words only deepened Naomi's confusion. Inside the administrative office, Human Resources Manager Karen Douglas invited her to sit before folding her hands neatly across a stack of paperwork. Her tone remained calm and professional. "Naomi, this is only a routine review. We understand you allowed a patient to use your personal phone during your shift." Naomi answered honestly. "Yes, he said he needed one final call. He did not have his own phone, and it lasted less than a minute." Karen nodded slowly. "Did he identify himself?" "No." "Did you know who he was?" "No, ma'am." Karen looked down at her notes before speaking again. "There is no accusation against you. However, because hospital policies encourage employees to avoid using personal devices with patients, we are placing you on temporary administrative leave until we complete our review." The words landed with quiet weight. Naomi did not argue. She simply lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "I understand." As she signed the required paperwork, she felt disappointment more than fear. She had always believed rules existed to protect people, yet she also believed compassion sometimes arrived before policies could catch up. Walking back through the lobby carrying her employee badge and lunch bag, she wondered whether she should have simply looked away like everyone else had. Outside, cool evening air greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Across the street, families continued entering the emergency department, each carrying invisible burdens of their own. Life inside the hospital moved forward without pause. Naomi stood quietly for a few moments, watching automatic doors open and close beneath the fading sunlight. Deep inside, she searched for regret but could not find it. If another frightened stranger asked for 30 seconds tomorrow, she knew she would probably make the same decision again. Several hundred miles away, inside a secure conference room overlooking Manhattan, independent investigators placed Naomi's phone number onto a large digital screen alongside the exact time of Arthur's call. One attorney looked toward the chairman and spoke carefully. She unknowingly became the final link that activated the emergency protocol. Another executive nodded. "Find her immediately." "Arthur," now sitting upright with a blanket across his knees, listened quietly before offering one simple correction. "No," he said with a gentle smile. "Do not find an employee. Find the young woman who reminded this company what integrity actually looks like." The apartment felt unusually quiet that evening. Naomi placed her hospital badge inside the top drawer of her small kitchen cabinet, not because she wanted to hide it, but because seeing it on the table made the temporary leave feel more permanent than it really was. She filled a kettle with water, listened to the soft whistle as it reached a boil, and poured a cup of chamomile tea into the same ceramic mug her father had once used after long days at work. Outside her second-floor window, the city moved with its usual rhythm. Children laughed in the courtyard below. A delivery truck rumbled past the corner grocery store. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed before fading into the cool evening air. Everything around her seemed perfectly ordinary, yet something inside her refused to settle. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The unfamiliar number from the previous night still sat alone in the call history, untouched, almost insignificant. She stared at it for several seconds before locking the screen again. It was only one phone call, she reminded herself. One stranger. One decision made in less than a minute. Yet somehow that single moment had followed her home, cost her time away from the job she loved, and filled her mind with questions that had no easy answers. She carried her tea onto the narrow apartment balcony where flower pots lined the railing, their autumn leaves beginning to curl beneath the cooler temperatures. A gentle breeze drifted through the neighborhood, carrying the scent of damp pavement left behind by the previous night's rain. Naomi wrapped both hands around the warm mug and watched the sky slowly shift from pale blue to soft shades of gold and amber. She remembered something her father had once told her while they sat on the front porch years earlier. "People will forget what you own," he had said with an easy smile. "But they rarely forget how you make them feel when life gets hard." At the time, she had been too young to understand why those words mattered. Now they returned with surprising clarity. She closed her eyes and pictured the old man's expression after he handed back her phone. There had been relief in his face, but also peace, as though a burden much heavier than illness had finally been lifted. Whatever that brief conversation had meant, it had mattered deeply to him. That thought alone eased the doubt beginning to grow inside her. Downstairs, her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed Naomi sitting quietly on the balcony and waved from the sidewalk while returning home with grocery bags. Naomi smiled and waved back. Small kindnesses, she thought, often arrived without headlines, applause, or recognition. They simply appeared when someone chose not to look away. As darkness settled across the city, the first stars became visible above the rooftops. Naomi finished the last sip of tea, breathed in the cool evening air, and whispered almost to herself, "I hope he is all right." Hundreds of miles away, Arthur Whitmore stood beside the large window of his private hospital suite for the first time since his admission. His physician had cleared him to leave the following morning. Beyond the glass, helicopters crossed the Manhattan skyline while office lights shimmered against the fading sunset. Behind him, several attorneys quietly reviewed documents detailing the successful activation of Project Phoenix. Every questionable financial transfer had been frozen. Every independent trustee had confirmed their authority. The company was secure. Arthur barely glanced at the paperwork. His attention rested instead on a single handwritten note lying beside the hospital bed. Across the top, he had written only one sentence in careful blue ink. "Find Naomi Brooks. Not to reward her. To thank her before the world changes her kindness into something she believes she should regret." The next morning began with an unfamiliar sound outside Naomi's apartment. It was not the rumble of a delivery truck or the city bus stopping on the corner. It was the quiet, synchronized arrival of several black sport utility vehicles moving slowly down her narrow residential street before coming to a stop one after another beneath the maple trees lining the sidewalk. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Dog walkers paused mid-step. Mrs. Henderson lowered her grocery bag onto the porch, unable to take her eyes off the unexpected procession. Naomi, still wearing a simple gray sweater and preparing breakfast, glanced through the kitchen window and assumed someone important must have the wrong address. A gentle knock sounded at her apartment door. She opened it cautiously and found a woman in a navy business suit standing beside two men carrying leather portfolios. The woman offered a respectful smile before speaking. Miss Naomi Brooks. Naomi nodded. Yes. Good morning. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I represent Whitmore Capital. Naomi searched her memory, but the company name meant nothing to her. Eleanor continued softly. There is someone who wishes to thank you in person, if you are willing. Confused but calm, Naomi accepted the invitation. 45 minutes later, one of the vehicles entered downtown Manhattan, passing towering glass buildings until it stopped in front of a headquarters unlike anything Naomi had ever seen. The lobby stretched upward beneath soaring ceilings where sunlight poured through enormous windows onto polished stone floors. Employees wearing tailored business attire moved quickly through security gates before suddenly slowing as Eleanor escorted Naomi toward a private elevator reserved for executive leadership. Nobody spoke. Curious eyes followed the young receptionist dressed in ordinary clothes as the elevator doors closed. When they opened again, Naomi stepped into a spacious conference room overlooking the city skyline. Around the long table sat independent trustees, attorneys, financial investigators, and senior executives whose expressions carried equal parts exhaustion and relief. At the far end of the room stood Arthur Whitmore, no longer wearing the faded jacket she remembered. His dark blue suit was elegant without being flashy, yet it was not the clothing that surprised Naomi. It was the way every person in the room instinctively rose to their feet the moment he entered. Arthur smiled warmly. Good morning, Naomi. She blinked in disbelief. You are? Eleanor answered quietly before Arthur could. He founded this company 52 years ago. The room remained silent as the realization settled over her. The quiet, elderly stranger from the hospital was not simply a successful businessman. He was the billionaire whose name appeared on skyscrapers, universities, and charitable foundations across the country. Arthur walked toward her with measured steps and stopped only a few feet away. Because you allowed one simple phone call, Project Phoenix was activated in time. Naomi looked at him, still struggling to understand. Arthur continued gently. During the night, an independent review prevented dishonest financial decisions that would have affected thousands of employees, retirees, scholarship programs, and hospitals supported by our foundation. You did not just help an old man. You protected countless families you will probably never meet. Several investigators quietly nodded in agreement. One attorney placed a thick report onto the conference table. The emergency safeguards worked exactly as designed. Arthur never looked at the report. His attention remained on Naomi. Every person in this room has degrees, titles, and experience. Yet none of us could have accomplished what you did because none of us were standing beside me when kindness was needed most. You were. Naomi lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of words she never expected to hear. She had believed she was simply lending someone her phone for less than a minute. She now understood that compassion, offered without expectation, had quietly changed the future of an entire company.